This is the chapter 3 overview. And I hope you'll find this chapter very interesting because it focuses on how laws are made. And I think most of the time we take it for granted that laws have been made, but we don't really put maybe a whole lot of thought into why they were made, who had a say in making them. There may be times when we don't understand why a law or a law is prohibiting or, in fact, maybe proscribing us to do something even exists. And prohibiting, we all know, means telling us we can't do something, but there are laws that proscribe what we can and what we should do. For example, we have to wear a seatbelt. That's a law that proscribes, that tells us what to do, versus a law that says don't speed, which is a law that prohibits us from doing something. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So there's a discussion in the textbook about early law and how laws were decided early on in ancient times, during medieval times, when kings and queens were very common. And so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, but I do want to just really quickly go over the Code of Hammurabi, which is, according to historians, one of the first known legal code. And it was largely based on religion, the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So retribution was a big part of the Code of Hammurabi. But it did, in fact, it was one of the first written codes that spelled out what punishment would be for certain types of behavior. Then, of course, Roman law came along. Romans then, came along and started to create written laws as well. And we know that one of their most inclusive statements about law is known as the 12 Tables of Roman Law. And this was the first secular written legal code. So while the Code of Hammurabi was largely based on religion, the 12 Tables of Roman law were largely based on secular ideas. And so we see here a shift away from religion and more into secular ideas. That is what society largely thought were actions that should be prohibited. Let me go here now to this idea of common law and the creation of the Magna Carta. And this is from the 13th century. And I know I'm a nerd because when I was in London last fall, I made it a point to go to Westminster Abbey because there are two places apparently in London, two museums that have copies of the Magna Carta, and these apparently are dated copies, meaning that they come from ancient times in the medieval period. And I can't read it really because it's in Latin. But just to be there and to see this very ancient document that really had a great influence over how we make laws today and who makes the laws and why we make laws was a big deal to me because, as I said, I am a nerd. So the Magna Carta is the next most important document that really starts to incorporate this idea of rights. What kind of rights do individuals have? Because previously, the other two documents weren't really focused so much on the rights of individuals. And here in the Magna Carta, we now start to see a mention of the right to a trial by jury. We also start to see a discussion in the Magna Carta of proportional punishment. Remember, Cesare Beccaria by the 17th century is talking about the same thing, but this is the earliest mention of this idea of the punishment should fit the crime. And of course, a really important right that we have in the United States, and that's the right against self-incrimination, which of course comes from the Fifth Amendment. And so let's focus now on precedent and stare decisis. And the term precedent has gotten a lot of usage this past summer, simply because of some of the decisions made by the U.S. Supreme Court. And of course, the case that I have heard it used most is in the Dobbs case, which is the case the U.S. Supreme Court decided, I believe it was on June 24th, which overturned Roe versus Wade. So first, precedent is the final decision by a court, right? So a court gets a case and listens to all the evidence, reads all the documents, and takes some time to formulate a decision and write it up, and then that is published. Precedent is that final decision by a court. So under the common law system, which was of course used by the colonists, they essentially took it from Britain. It's useful because it enables us to know that a decision that was decided in a particular case with a certain set of facts, that the next time that situation arises, and if it's a similar set of facts, that's going to be the same way that that case is dealt with. So we know now what things are going to be allowed and how you'll be punished and what things will not be allowed. And if it's not allowed, what the punishment is. And in the US, the precedent, that is the final decision of the court, is only binding on the courts within the jurisdiction of a particular court. So, for example, in California, the California Supreme Court decisions are only binding upon California. However, if it's the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, well, then it's binding on all the states that are part of the Ninth Circuit. So California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and I think Utah's part of the Ninth Circuit as well. On the other hand, if we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court, well, that's, quote, the law of the land, so it applies across the United States. Stare decisis is Latin, and it means let the decision stand. So the idea behind precedent is stare decisis. It's the idea that that decision should stand, that any instance in which these types of behavior or activities or rights are being challenged, this is going to be the decision because that's how prior courts have already decided it. So again, it ensures predictability, right? We don't always have to go to court, although we do go to court quite a bit. And the U.S. Supreme Court only accepts about 10% of the cases that it receives on a writ of certiorari every year. The other 90% are denied because, again, stare decisis, precedent, let the decision stand. Ratio, and this is always hard for me to say, ratio decidendi, decidendi, I'm not quite sure how to say it, never knew. It's the reason for the decision. Essentially, what happens is that a court issues its decision, and in that decision, it takes great pains to spell out the reasons for its opinion. And some of these opinions can be quite lengthy, particularly Supreme Court decisions, but almost any court will issue fairly lengthy decisions because the judge or judges, if it's a panel of judges, want to be certain that they have explained fully why they've reached a decision, so that lawyers who maybe have a case that's similar can read that case and understand, aha, okay, so I have a client who has very similar circumstances. They're not the same, but they're very similar. And so this case is decisive. That is, this case is controlling. So maybe I don't file a lawsuit, or maybe I do, because my case is very different from this one. Obiter dicta, what we often just call dicta. These are any statements. They're sometimes legal statements, sometimes they're not, but they're used to support the ratio decidendi. They're used to support the reasons why the court has made its decision. Okay, so, for example, here's an example of dicta. In the Dobbs case, where the Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade. Chief Justice Alito took pains to say that not only is there no constitutional right enumerated in the Constitution, no right, individual right, or right to privacy that is enumerated in the Constitution, but he also pointed out how different things are today than in 1973 when Roe versus Wade was decided. Justice Alito pointed out that today there are many instances, well, first of all, that there's not as much of a stigma if you're an unwed woman who's pregnant. Also, that women have more opportunities today for putting their children up for adoption, that getting an abortion because a child has potentially may have some type of birth defect, that there's so much more technology today to aid in the treatment of these different types of birth defects, etc. So that's dicta. That's just the justice saying, hey, well, this is my opinion. The justice is saying, hey, it makes me feel better to tell you all of these things because it makes my decision sound more rational. Okay, so let's see. I think it's it there. Okay, all right. So under common law, there are typically 4 parts to individual rights, or there are 4 parts of common law: individual rights, rights that individuals have, you and I. The public wrongs. So what do people do that harm society? So those are usually what we think of as street crimes or white-collar crimes. What are private wrongs? These are torts. In law, these are called torts. I do you wrong, and so you sue me. I injure you, you sue me. And then property rights, whether it's a home, real estate, or whether it's personal property, car, say, or lend your best jewelry to your neighbor and your neighbor returns it and it's damaged, right? Something like that. All right, so now what I'd really like to focus on are first the sources of law, and then I really would like to focus on there are all of the Bill of Rights, which are the amendments to the Constitution 1 through 10, but also the other amendments, 14, for example, and the Articles of Confederation, etc. There's a lot of detail there, and I trust that you will read that, but I want to really focus on the sources of law and then the most important amendments in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so where do we get law? Well, we get it from legislation. Legislatures pass laws. So state legislatures for the whole state, city legislatures for the city, county legislatures for the county. So we have different layers of legislation. So it's the local level, the city, county level, state level, and then of course the national level. So that in Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, they're coming up with laws, passing them, and then the president signs them into law. Of course, there's administrative regulations, and these are essentially rules that various administrative entities within a state or even a county, and again at the national level, administrative agencies, so the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Trade Communications, the FTC, Federal Trade and Communications, the FCC, the Federal Communications. Excuse me, I'm going to cough here, so I'm going to pause this. Excuse me, a little tickle in my throat there. And so we've got all these agencies, and they come up with their own set of rules, which we call administrative regulations for how they're going to operate. And both state and federal government have these administrative agencies. For example, in California, Cal-OSHA is an administration that is tasked with overseeing the safety of workplaces in California. And they have their own administrative regulations. But of course, there's a federal OSHA, Office of Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they're charged with overseeing